previous years, I think the quality of the presentations you're about to hear will more than outweigh the numbers. A very interesting time for journalism at the moment, a very interesting time more than just for journalism, perhaps for society in general. And I think we have a panel, not just here but throughout the day, of speakers to reflect that. The nature of these conferences it was originally that we started with the British Journalism Review, and I hope you'll be staying on this evening for the presentation. But what we've tried to do in these over the years is to start with more academic presentations and then move into what we call the industry panels, which will be taking place this afternoon, and then leading through to the presentation of the BJR Award and the Q&A with Alan Rusbridger of The Guardian. The story continues to go on. Amelia Gentleman is not to be prosecuted. It just keeps moving and moving, this one. You can't, it's like quicksilver. You can't ever quite hold on to it. I hope, however, today we'll shine quite a lot of light onto it and perhaps make it a bit more clear as to what is going on and indeed perhaps where it might be going. So to start our first session, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Peter Goodwin.
Okay, my name is Pete Goodwin. I'm the Research Director at the School of Media Arts and Design, and I'm chairing, and I should be a relatively active chair, in other words, I'll put my threepenny worth in if necessary, a discussion on the question of media ethics after phone hacking. And we have three panellists. We have Julian Petley from Brunel University, who is a long-term campaigner on issues of media regulation and censorship and so on, amongst other things. And it's wearing a suitably subversive T-shirt today, I note, yes. We have Jean Seaton, who is at our own university, Westminster, who is currently, amongst many other things, beavering away on the history of the BBC. And we have Steve Barnett, who is also at Westminster, who is taking temporary leave from observing the Leveson inquiry. We've managed to prize him away from the Leveson inquiry. But as I think you will find out soon, it's already got to his soul, yes, the Leveson inquiry. So I'll start off by, and we'll bring you in later in the session, by just asking our three panellists for up to 5 minutes each, if they can say what they think is the big things for media ethics in general that have emerged from phone hacking. What are the big consequences? Julian.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Well, I think one of the things that's emerged from all of this is things that many of us, and I expect many of us in this room, really knew already. I mean, I think people who have looked to the Leveson inquiry for massive revelations or some idea that, that Tony Blair would at last tell the truth about his relationship with the media moguls would be sorely disappointed. I mean, to me, the most interesting things which have emerged from Leveson have actually not been the testimony so much, but the emails. Those have been extraordinarily interesting. It's those that I think which will finally, for example, eventually nail Jeremy Hunt. So I don't think Leveson has produced anything terribly surprising, but what it has produced, of course, is a vast amount of evidence of one kind or another, which enables, media and specifically press critics like us on the platform here, and enables us to, will enable us in future years to prove many of the points that we've been making for a very long time. There is a huge amount of empirical data there, which, although may not be terribly surprising, will be incredibly useful for future historians of the press, so that we can actually show in detail what's been going on. If you've been a critic of the press for as long as I have, you do get used to people saying, oh, you're just imagining things, or oh, you're paranoid, or oh, you're left-wing, or mad, or whatever. But all of this has really, I I think, provided a huge amount of useful ammunition to back up the kinds of points which we know to be true. So that's what I think is interesting about Leveson. But I just wind up by saying, I've got to the point now myself, and Steve and I have both given written and oral evidence to Leveson. I've got to the point where I'm beginning to wish Leveson was over, because I don't think we're really going to learn a huge amount more now. And the really important battle, I think, is not at Leveson, it's after Leveson, it's post-Leveson. My own feeling, which is based on talking to quite a few people involved in the inquiry, is that Leveson will come up with some interesting proposals. I don't think that he's going to propose a souped-up Press Complaints Commission or Press Complaints Commission 2.0. I do think he's going to propose something which will have an element of backstop regulatory power or co-regulation about it, perhaps something along the lines of the Advertising Standards Authority or something like that. That's what I think will happen. But the real battle is going to come when Leveson has made his recommendations. The real battle will be, will the government actually accept them? Because what is blindingly obviously going to happen post-Leveson is that the newspaper industry will have a kind of revamped PCC just waiting in the wings. They will say, look, we've put our own house in order, we've got this plan for a new PCC, we don't need what Leveson says. So there will be a huge campaign, I think, in the newspapers, which will say what I've just said. It'll also say, look, the problem was with the News of the World. The News of the World's no longer with us. You know, we can't start having new regulatory systems for the press because of a newspaper that no longer exists. So there will be an awful lot of stuff in most of the newspapers arguing against whatever it is that Leveson comes up with and in favour of what the newspaper industry comes up with. But of course, we all know perfectly well, and again, the Leveson inquiry has brought this somewhat out into the light, that there will be a phenomenal amount of behind-the-scenes lobbying going on, pressuring the government to not do, I think, what Leveson wants, and also, of course, trying to pressurise the Labour Party and the Lib Dems as well. So, to conclude, my point is that the battle almost begins once Leveson reports, and that's when we're going to have to do our absolute utmost, I think, to organise a huge public campaign of pressure to ensure that what Leveson suggests is actually put into practice. And I'll just wind up, because I think Steve might want to mention this. There's a very, very interesting article indeed, which Steve has written in the current issue of the BJR, okay, I'm plugging the journal, but about public attitudes towards this whole notion of stories which are in the public interest. And I think that if the public attitudes are as they appear to be in the research that YouGov has done, I think in many ways we're kind of pushing at an open door if we are going to try to get a really big public campaign going to fall in behind what Leveson suggests.
Okay, thank you very much, Julian. I'm sure a number of points will be exploring that. Jean?
I thought you would go to Steve. I really wanted to say a couple of things. I think that what Leveson has shown is a problem of newsroom culture, and it's worth thinking about that. In the two cases that I have actually very direct personal experience of, one of which was the outing of, I run a prize called the Orwell Prize, and we have a blog prize, and the first winner of that was a policeman who blogged under the name of Nightjap. And the Times broke into his computer, which is what he thought it was when it happened in 2009, but at the time it looked like, and the Times went to court and said that they'd put together his name from material in the public domain, which was very puzzling because I knew how difficult it was to get to this policeman who was blogging, because I'd had to do it in order to give him the prize. And what was interesting about that case is it's actually in itself a rather trivial case. It's not entirely trivial for Richard Horton, the policeman whose career could well have been ruined by what the Times did, who will never quite know whether his career will now have a completely different path from the one it did have. But, you know, it was trivial in comparison to some other things. News International, there's a court case rumbling along. What was interesting about that was, there was two things, one of which is that the editor of the Times clearly perjured himself in 2009, and he re-perjured himself quite extraordinarily at the beginning of the Leveson inquiry, which is really extraordinary. I mean, if I was up in front of the Leveson inquiry, I think I would have done my work and made sure that I didn't perjure myself a second time. But what was interesting about that was that the young journalist who cracked his way into Richard Horton's computer had been employed by the Times. He was in one sense, you know, what Rupert most likes to call the one rogue reporter. But his only previous journalistic experience, which is why they'd hired him. So he's a young man with a good nose for a story, was hacking his way into the computers of the Oxford Union Secretariat. That's say he was a stroppy young man, actually might have turned into a really good journalist, has that kind of nose for a story. But they'd employed him simply because that's what he could do. So and he is very much, his career will definitely be ruined. He's a young man, he's 27, there's a court case going on. Actually, he was employed and then not editorially managed in his own self-interest. So it seemed to me that the people that were really culpable were his direct managers, one of whom was Dan Supper, who now works at The Guardian, but we won't mention that. And in a sense, his editor, and certainly the legal advice that the Times was taking. So the person that's taking the hit was, in a sense, the product of an irresponsible newsroom culture, which actually has let this individual hang out. The other case, it's not the same, but I conclude exactly the same conclusions from it, is the case of Johan Hari, who, again on the Orwell Prize, we had to strip him of his prize in about July last year, who again was actually rather, in lots of ways, you knew exactly what you got, rather an extraordinary young journalist who was not editorially managed. And The Independent repeatedly actually told me that his journalism stood up. It clearly didn't. So from that you conclude that the problem is not where it appears to be, it's in newsroom cultures, which may betray young journalists, actually. And that it was such, Gabby Hinscliffe, who I've got great respect for, said that what was most frightening really about both of those cases was how ubiquitous a very casual newsroom culture was, that you could do these things, that it was anything went. At a time, so that I think what I conclude after Leveson is that I have no problems with journalists doing completely irresponsible, improper things in the public interest. That's what they're there to do. One doesn't want to end up with a kind of Catholic Church index of prescribed acts. You know, the prescription of the act is not what you want. You need, on the contrary, a very positive definition of what is in the public interest, not just what the public is interested in. And I think if we come out of it with any of those senses, that would be good.